Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another Africa Oil and Power and African Energy Chamber webinar. Today, we are going to be looking at navigating risk, increasing threats in the African energy market under COVID-19. Our esteemed panelists are going to be looking at the issue of a double black swan event with COVID-19 and that economic impact combined with low oil prices. And look at everything from geopolitical risk to the actual physical assets on the ground, as well as cybersecurity. Before I introduce my co-moderator, I just want to get into a couple housekeeping items. We have here a chat box. Everybody, you can please use this chat box to discuss amongst yourself. Please note, though, that if you want a message to go to all of the audience members, you need to change the to subject line to all panelists and attendees. But please feel free to chat here, make comments, engage with each other. We also have a Q&A box. Please feel free to submit questions through this Q&A box, and we'll be asking questions to our panelists during the course of the webinar. If everybody can please just take a moment to type where you're from, what company you're with in the chat box, just to kind of get the conversation going and see see where everybody's from. And with that, I'm going to turn the webinar over to my colleague and co-moderator, James Chester, the acting CEO of Africa Oil and Power.
Thank you very much, Katie. Happy Friday, everybody out there. I'm James Chester, acting CEO of Africa Oil and Power. Thank you very much for joining us. We have three fantastic panelists with us today. If I may just take a moment to introduce all of them before we get started. So first we have Dr. Sarah Vakshuri. Sarah is the founder and president of SVB Energy International, a strategic energy consulting firm. She joins us from, I think, Washington, DC. Is that right?
Yes.
So Dr. Vakshuri has 2 decades of experience working in the energy industry, extensive experience in global energy market studies, energy strategy, security, geopolitical risk, consulted numerous governments, public and private entities, and international organizations like the IMF and World Bank. So welcome, Sarah, to the webinar. Second, let me just introduce Sean Duthie. He's the managing director and founder of Inyani Intelligence. Welcome, Sean. This is an Africa-focused corporate intelligence firm with activities in many of the same markets that we're in as Africa Oil and Power. He was previously a lecturer of political studies at the University of Cape Town, and Sean also joined us to moderate another webinar quite recently. Personal fact about Sean, he's a renowned brewer of fine beers in Cape Town, as well as being an expert on risk. And we have Derek Campbell joining us, CEO of Energy and Natural Resource Security, Inc. They ensure that owners and operators of assets achieve resiliency, maintain continuity of operations, an expert on mitigating risk on an operational level. Derek, it's very nice to have you join us again. And a personal fact about Derek, he's a colonel in the US Marine Corps Reserve. And welcome to all our panelists, and let's get started. Thanks very much in advance, Katie. We welcome questions from the audience in the Q&A box. And as Katie said, let us know who you are, where you're from in the chat box, and we'll bring all those interactions into the webinar as much as we can. So I'll start with you, Sarah, if I may. Can you just start by giving us a bit of context on the impact of global lockdowns on the African energy sector from your perspective?
Sure. So thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be part of this event today. So overall, the global lockdowns as a result of COVID-19 had a severe impact on both prices and demand. So this double shock that from one side the prices have collapsed, on the other side the demand, which are obviously interrelated together, have all implications for economies of both consumer and if a country is a producer of oil in more significant scales. So what happened is that the African countries, especially those that they are relying on their export of oil, have faced different challenges, starting with security of demand, because obviously the global consumption of oil have significantly hit by the global lockdowns, starting in April from 20 to 25 million barrels per day, and demand recovered until this month with the shortfall of about still 13 or 10 to 13 million barrels of oil demand shortfall. Obviously, there's expectations that by the end of this year, the demand is going to increase further, and the countries can start in ramping up their exports. But in case of some of the African major oil producers like Nigeria, we see that Nigeria did not really comply with the OPEC plus cut production in the past 2 months, obviously trying to ramp up its production. US shale growth was a major competitor to Nigeria oil. So Nigeria was not really cutting back its export in the past couple of months, but now they are they're committed to reduce their oil output gradually. The other impact is obviously on their economies, because the lower oil prices will have will leave these governments with less cash and less money to finance their projects. There has been significant strategies to extend the transportation, electricity access, clean cooking. So there are plenty of healthcare, which with the increased numbers of COVID in these countries is going to increase their budget expenditures for health reasons, so reduces the cash. These all could have security implications, because some of these governments might be incapable of paying for their securities, and we know that some of these countries already, like Nigeria or some other countries, are having security issues with some of the insurgency groups. The other impact would be on investment. Obviously, there is less cash and capital left for investment. About 40% of gas discoveries, global discoveries from 2011 to 2018 was in Africa, from Egypt to East Africa, Mozambique, Tanzania to East Africa and South Africa. So there's going to be underinvestment in these countries, and overall different issues. There are other issues like cybersecurity that I know that my colleague Derek will look into that.
Thank you very much. Sean, I'll bring this to you. Maybe you can kind of expand on this a bit in terms of you know, how these factors impact things on the ground in certain countries like South Africa, like Mozambique, for instance. Problems with bringing investment in, problems with maintaining security. So what do you think?
Sure. Well, thank you very much. And I think, like Sarah said, I think the big impact from COVID-19 has been also the kind of government-sponsored and government-imposed lockdowns, which have very negatively hit all the economies where they have put in. And it's this hit on the economy that increases the risk for all businesses, for people looking to invest. The fact that the economy is going down, there's quite a large amount of things that could happen. But as an example, I think Sarah said, lack of money in the government coffers means a lack of money for social services, social delivery. This could lead to social conflict as the population gets upset because nothing's happening. You know, nothing's happening. I mean, in South Africa, the schools are closed. They've had a very hard lockdown. We haven't seen very much protest, actually, surprisingly, for South Africa. But underneath it all, there is a growing social tension about how the government's lockdown has affected people's livelihood, affected the economy, affected people's jobs. Looking higher up, more macro, this loss of revenue and the poor economy might make a government think, right, where are we going to get our money from in the future? And so we might see new regulations coming in that increase taxes or financial burdens on foreign companies, especially. I think a lot of governments will be loath to try and tax their own population, but they will look to large multinational corporations and say, right, you have a lot of money, you're taking our natural resources. That's where we're going to look for money. Again, this hasn't happened yet, but this is a risk for a lot of places, especially more the riskier places, DRC, Burkina Faso, where they do have natural resources. And one of the main things that we've seen in the past couple of years is these kind of flippant lawsuits or legal regulators. So you haven't paid your taxes, you haven't done this, therefore you owe us some extraordinary amount, $3-4 billion, but all in the hopes of getting a couple $100 million into the coffers. So obviously there's a lot of these risks are coming from the economy. Fortunately, we haven't seen anything yet, but I think even with COVID-19, and I mean, I think the vaccine is maybe people are predicting mid 2021. The effects of COVID-19 and the risks inherent because of it are going to last in Africa for quite a while.
Thank you. And there was a question that we were kind of talking about before we started the webinar, and I'll carry this over to you in a second, Derek. But how much of these security challenges or these risk challenges actually associated with COVID-19? How much is systemic already? Sean, sorry.
Is that for me?
Yeah, and then we'll go to Derek.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and I mean, Derek and Sarah and I have chatted about this. I don't think COVID-19, the way I see it, I mean, it's a blip. It's a big blip, but it has delayed a lot of things that are happening in Mozambique, in South Africa. They've been pushed back. But as far as COVID-19 causing, a lot of new risks, that's more minimal. But what it has done is it's exacerbated all the risks that we already had in these countries, and maybe brought in risks that we had before, but because of good economic growth in some of these countries that had lowered, but now with a more depressing economy, those risks are coming back.
Thank you. Derek, what do you think about this?
A couple of things. I mean, James, as I've said to you, I don't know if COVID-19 is a driver for Africa, as Sarah mentioned at the top of the hour. I will tell you, though, that when you get situations like COVID-19 coupled with the depressed oil prices, you now have situations where people are not at work, which means your facilities are exposed. I mean, the things I'm talking about are less geopolitical and more kind of tactical on the ground issues. You've got your assets exposed, you've got human terrain gaps, you have cybersecurity gaps, you have indications and warnings about extremist groups really looking at ways to attack infrastructure to make their points, whatever those political points are. And so I would say to you that, COVID-19 has impacted the challenges that exist in sub-Saharan Africa, but they are not drivers for some of the things that we see right now. I just think that they've maybe created some targets of opportunity.
Yeah.
Okay, and Sarah, I invite you to weigh in on this because you're nodding enthusiastically.
Well, actually, I do agree with Derek, is that some of these problems were actually systematic before the COVID to begin with. For instance, most of the African countries are severely relying on one source, export, and they are significantly reliant on internal on their importing a lot of goods, so they are heavily dependent on their imports. So, for instance, their foreign exchange is very much relies on their source of export. So if there are, let's say, like countries like Angola or Nigeria that they're oil exporting countries, the amount of their oil revenue impacts the countries, not only the government's budget, but because of this is the only source of their foreign exchange reserve, is going to impact the country. The other thing that Sean mentioned question is taxation. Very good point is that most of the African countries cannot or are not able to sufficiently fund their own projects because their taxation system and income from taxes, it has not been in a very transparent or efficient way to begin with, even before COVID. But there are some opportunities that actually has created for Africa. One, as I briefly alluded to, is that, for instance, US shale oil production has taken a big chunk of market from lighter oil producers in Africa. Now we're expecting a medium-term cutback of US shale production, perhaps not having a shale production growth for some years to come. So this will give back an opportunity for light producers to expand their export. I should open this parenthesis here, that now we obviously at this moment and in the short term we have a demand issue, so the demand yet to recover. But the other opportunity is that Africa, not only in oil but other resources like platinum that South Africa produces, like more than 70% of global platinum, or Democratic Republic of Congo produces 2/3 of cobalt. These are all materials that are used in renewable energy. So that as the world is moving into the energy transition, some of these resources that are produced in Africa, aside from those significant natural gas reserves that have been discovered, are very important to the world, and the investment costs in some of these countries are very low. So for global investors that in the time of recession or issues with COVID, that they have less cash flow, they would obviously be more interested in some of the resources and reserves in Africa to invest because of the lower investment costs. But overall, it leaves less money in the pocket of the government to pay for from their payroll, social expenditures to any investment if they were planning to do.
Absolutely. And maybe I can go back to you, Derek. I wanted to get something I really wanted to know from you. I mean, what are the things that we're not thinking about? You know, you talk from a tactical kind of on the ground level about risk and security. You know, what are we missing here?
That's a great question, James. I think we're missing a lot, particularly in Africa, right? You heard me talk about this before, about this concept of staying vigilant, right? And you have to now, particularly in this very challenging time where you have, as I said, you know, reduced manpower, lack of risk identification methods. You've got increased indications and warning about the threats that exist, particularly on the extremist front. And then you've got actually invasion of sites, sometimes not even by any negative extremist actor. It's just by curious people. But then again, that's still the security breach. And again, the rubric and framework I'm talking about is at the tactical level, right, on the ground at the asset. And so some of the recommendations that I would make, I think, are to make sure you've got some kind of consistent review program going on, consistent assessment program going on using, you know, very global standards to address some of these issues, like NIST 800-171, the ISO protocols 27001, etc. You've got to be able to figure out a way to monitor your employees during this very challenging time, because sometimes you'll have threats, particularly on the cyber front, where people are integrating and injecting malware and ransomware, sometimes unbeknownst to themselves, into your assets, again, causing problems, right, for you. And again, the thing that as an owner, as an operator, that you really need to focus on is you've got to be able to, you've heard me say this before, James, ensure resiliency so that you can maintain continuity of operations. Because if you can't maintain continuity of operations, you can't optimize and monetize the asset. And that is really the thing that's at risk here. It is the capital investments that go into these types of projects, whether it's upstream, midstream, downstream, transmission, generation, distribution, they're impacted by things like COVID, by things like depressed oil prices, because your posture is down. You're not concerned on really protecting that asset from a physical or cyber risk perspective. You're only concerned about the financial risk, but you forget that those physical and cyber things will impact that financial risk overall. And so, again, having a periodic assessment or review of where you stand, particularly in these downtimes when you've got exposure. That's really the prudent thing to do. Am I making sense there?
Yeah, and I'm wondering, you know, has there been enough of a kind of evolution in our understanding of security for the kind of assets that you're talking about? You know, we hear a lot about piracy, about bunkering, about conflict in places like the Niger Delta. But you know, how much has really changed? Are we actually assessing this risk properly?
I would tell you in sub-Saharan Africa, no, unfortunately, right? The OECD countries are very good at that, particularly on the cyber side. They're getting better. But I mean, you look at the number of attacks that have happened just offshore Equatorial Guinea within the last 2 or 3 weeks, what's happened in Mozambique from a physical perspective. You can go back historically and look at what happened in Algeria in 2000, I think, 11 or 12. And you look at the consistent threats that happen in Nigeria to the operational networks, particularly in oil and gas, whether onshore or offshore, whether by vandals, extremist groups, the boys in the creeks, as they say. You would think that the number of producers, whether it be oil and gas or mining even in Africa, they would really pay some attention to these issues, but you don't see it at the scale that you need to see it at, right? One of the things is because the insurers and the investors don't necessarily mandate that the owners and operators really take a focused look at security, right? When they do these capital investments, they squeeze these projects and say, hey, if this was an OECD investment or an investment in an OECD country, we'd let this investment mature. We would help let this oil and gas asset grow, and everybody would be happy because we get great returns on the money, and we'll let the operators breathe, and we'll let them enhance and mature the asset. That doesn't happen in sub-Saharan Africa. When the investors come in, they squeeze those projects. They have to charge them a high rate of return, interest rate of return on that asset. And the next thing you know, they're saying, hey, in order to mitigate our financial risk, we'll just squeeze the project and then get our returns in 3 years. Well, what happens? The operator then, post that 3-year period, can't mature the project because he doesn't have any cash. Well, right now, one of the things that they can do to mitigate that kind of financial interplay that they have, the owners and operators, is show that they've done some assessment, they figured out a way to mitigate that physical and cyber risk, and then that's going to give the insurers and the investors a little bit more confidence about letting that project mature. And so if there was one message I had to give to the owners and operators, it would be do not take your security, the security of your asset, whether it's a new greenfield project or some ongoing activity, don't look at security as a cost. It is an investment that will help you mature that asset and make it grow. Does that make sense, James?
Indeed, it does.
Yeah.
I believe that we have a question from the audience.
We do. We're actually getting a couple questions from the audience. Some are related to investment in pioneer markets, which we'll get to in just a little bit. But before we leave this topic specifically, Andrew has a question about, he says, what is the advice for African energy asset owners that don't know where to begin when it comes to cyber and physical security? What is the first step, and what does that scope of work entail?
Yeah, so I would tell you that we recommend that you have an energy security risk and resiliency assessment. That's what we provide. And an assessment does a couple of things. It lets you know where you are with the posture that you have, and it also helps you understand where you need to be so that in case there is an attack, right, you understand how to implement the things that make you resilient and ultimately maintain your continuity of operations. In addition to having an assessment done initially to understand where you are, and then, hey, what are the most prudent security methodologies that I need to put in place in order to make me resilient and ensure that I can maintain those continuity of operations. The other issue is you need to do that on a periodic basis. You know, it's not a one-shot play, right? Don't do that only in the initial phases of your operation and think you're good to go. You got to monitor that. It has to be a C-suite level area of concern, because it's all about ultimately making sure that you optimize and monetize that asset.
Thank you. I'm going to direct a question at you, Sean, actually, and kind of continuing from where we are now, but looking at Mozambique specifically, if we can, where we have a project where FID is now delayed, Rovuma LNG, where there is a physical threat from armed groups potentially, and there's questions about oil and gas benefiting the community, all of these kinds of things. So we're going to sort of look at a rebalancing of our view of the benefits of oil and gas projects, reconsider some parts of this in light of physical attacks on assets, and questions on how beneficial these gas developments are, in this case in Mozambique, but really anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, good question. But I think I don't see much change post-COVID as far as the influence of oil and gas. I mean, oil and gas is still very important, and while there might be a shift to renewables, I don't see this happening because of COVID, or after it. I think, like we've said, everything's been delayed. Everything's going to take a little bit longer than we had originally thought it would, and originally forecast it to. But it's still going to happen. So Mozambique is still a very hot topic. I think people are still looking to get in there, even though things have been delayed. So even, I mean, FID was delayed, but I think Total just found 15 billion investment. There's still a lot of appetite for that risk. I think as far as Mozambique's been quite interesting, because I think whenever I hear people talk about, everyone's very bullish about it, everyone's very excited, and rightfully so. I mean, it's a massive find. And I mean, Derek and I have spoken about this as well. I'm always amazed about how in the kind of the discovery and finding and the excitement of getting into Mozambique, people and companies seem to forget about, well, this is a long-term project and this is a long-term program. What is it going to be like? And I've heard a lot of very smart investors say they didn't, they're happy with the currency convertibility, they're happy with the government's stance, and at the moment, yes. But hopefully what COVID-19 and the drop in the oil price and these black swans maybe has made investors realize that you have to be prepared for things like this. If you want to survive, you have to have a risk mitigation and action plan, and it's not good enough to just kind of, and for us, you get people who say, I want a political risk report, and we say, okay, we can do it, and here's how much it costs, and here's what we do, and we think, we'd like, and I mean, I think they think we just want the money, but we say we'd like to be on a retainer, because a one-time thing done in June 2020 is not the same as it done in December 2020. These risks change and the situation on the ground changes, and to be able to mitigate those risks and to be successful in these countries to look after, you need to see it as a living document and something that's changing. I mean, Mozambique is a perfect example where 2017, everyone kind of saw it as there were a couple of beheadings, and it's almost copycat of what's happening in Somalia and in Syria at the time. And what we have now is a completely different situation. And I mean, you could see it coming, and no one really knows what their motive is. But if you're a company that is trying to go into Mozambique or that is in Mozambique, I think, and hopefully COVID has kind of made them think about this. You need to be prepared for these sorts of changes, and you need to have a strategy of what are we going to do if this happens, and if this happens, and if this happens, and if this happens, and that way you can be successful. But I think, I saw, I don't know if you're going to ask the question. I saw there was a colleague from Sao Tome, Eurico, asked about opportunities, and I think there is a lot of opportunity in Africa and in Mozambique, but investors and companies need to be prepared.
Hey, James, can I chime in on Mozambique? Yeah, because Sean and I have talked a little bit about that. Listen, I don't want to talk on fire and brimstone. You know how I can get at times, but listen, I think the operators there, the oil and gas, both operators and the service companies, they need to be a little bit more diligent about this issue about physical security in Mozambique, about the ability to track their personnel, the ability to engage the local population so that any project they do, whether it is on the natural gas facility, LNG facility itself, or some, service field operating base, right? That you need to make the local population feel like they are a part of the project. And guess what? You would be derelict if you left it up to the government to help you do that, right? So when people talk about security, they only talk about physical and cyber. They sometimes forget, in order to get what we call domain awareness, superiority, it means mastery of the domain that your infrastructure is operating in. You've got to be able to engage and manage that human terrain. And one of the problems with a lot of the current operators who are going in there, they're looking at the financial dynamics of the potential projects that are going to take off between now and 2022. They are not looking at, hey, how do you engage the population so we can secure this investment? And I think if they don't do that, what's going to happen is there'll continually be delays on this project, and you're asking for a government who doesn't have a lot of capability right now to do the things that you need to do as an investor to make sure that you and your personnel in the project are secure, so that ultimately you can optimize and monetize it, right? And that's the thing I think they're forgetting. And any folks who are in that oil and gas service space or the operators themselves, I beseech them to say, hey, take a holistic, very engaged approach, get an assessment done, and that assessment shouldn't be about your physical asset only. It should also be about the environment that it's in, so that you know how to manage the human terrain there.
Yeah. Sarah, I don't know if you want to weigh in here, but I'd like to ask, maybe, Nigeria is a bit more your scene. Maybe we can kind of put this in the context of what's been done there, and any other points that you may have on Mozambique. So
I would like to just, before to dive into that topic, add another issue on security aspect, which is cybersecurity. With all these lockdowns, many things have gone online. Now we're sitting and talking over an online platform. So the security of data, the security of even the physical security of infrastructure that are all monitored and managed through softwares are very important. Security of the grid, as Africa is looking into expanding its grid system, because when we're looking into government by government, each country in Africa, the electricity access, which is, we could say, like a core of most of the government plannings in Africa, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is expanding the grid. So a central grid is almost more than half of their plannings for electricity access to the people. So it's obviously a cybersecurity and security of the grid is very important. With regard to general overall security in the long term, there is a need for a strategic long-term view when it comes I'm talking more on a government side when they're taking decisions. I know that Derek and Sean pretty much cover the company's risks, but it's very important because Africa is looking into expanding its energy access, which is important. Africa has the youngest and fastest growing population. 1 in 2 people born until 2014 is in Africa. So this all means that there is going to be a huge demand in Africa for electricity, almost a huge portion of gas demand growth in the world by 2040 are all estimated to be in Africa. So also the plans for, let's say, clean cooking, which is using a lot of LPG and is based on consumption of LPG. So the fundamentals of this energy mix and energy transition, the infrastructure that governments are planning to grow, these are all things that should be think in advance and are very important in a strategic thinking. Looking into different countries, for instance, Kenya at this time, 2/3 of Kenya's power generations comes from bioenergy, and by 2040, 50% of this would be from geothermal. moving to Nigeria, Nigeria's power generation, about 80% of it is based on natural gas, and the rest is oil. So we are expecting that, you know, the share of natural gas remains strong when it comes to Nigeria. Ethiopia is another example that most of its power generation and power generation growth would be from hydro power. So obviously, when we talk about Africa as a continent, each country has a different case and different sources, assets, and access to different sources of energy. But it's very important when it's prioritize and strategize long-term plans for energy infrastructure, both on transportation, which most of the transportation in Africa and all these vehicle growth are, as of now, what the indication shows that they're based on fuels that are generated from oil. The electricity, the gas consumption, obviously, and for clean cooking, LPG is a source that we are looking to expand consumption of them in Africa. Something that could be an opportunity is that Africa has huge sources of gas that I already mentioned, and if the thing about Africa is that the consumption of natural gas by the decades to come is still less than what they are going to produce if all the investment taken as it was planned. So Africa, countries like Mozambique and Egypt have opportunities for exporting LNGs if all the investment taken and happen as it was planning. So there are a lot of opportunities for different countries in Africa looking into long-term strategies to how to set fundamentals for all of these important assets. The other thing that it should be all mentioned into, it's a security issue, I would say, but is a water energy nexus and access to clean water, and how energy is used to create and increase the access to the clean water for the people in Africa and all these population that is growing. Climate change, which Africa has a very little contribution to global CO2 emissions, but on the other side is going to be impacted by global warming severely, because about 700 million people in Africa living in areas that during the day the temperature raises significantly, and the population in these areas are going to grow double to that. So we're expecting that these cooling systems needed, you know, because the temperature is obviously rising, there might be flooding. So all these countries, the African governments, should be prepared for even in terms of regulations and in terms of like which types of cooling systems could be used in these countries and also infrastructure. So I think it's very important to have that strategic view when it comes to the government and government business relations when they're looking into long-term investment.
Absolutely.
James,
thank you very much.
James, may I comment on some of that? Yeah, sure thing. Not to stop your flow, but Sarah brought up some really good points about this government to business interaction. And you know, in Africa in particular, there is a good mix of not only NOC initiatives, but the sub IOCs and then the local operators, right? Like the Shorelines, the Owandos of the world, et cetera. One of the things that people have to be very careful of is that, particularly the local operators, when they get involved in operating an asset, ultimately the government benefits from that, right? And too often this is all about the money, and the other things from operational efficiencies to things like security, right, are never really taken into full account in the beginning of the operation, right? They're taken into account kind of midway or as the operation is in full swing. And then you have impacts where they can't produce the number of barrels that they should. Some of our good friends, as you know, in Nigeria have challenges in this space, right? If you look at the amount of shut-in product that happens from vandalism, from terrorism, from just bad actors who are impacting that local national operator, right? Well, they do that for a couple of reasons, right? One of them is to also impact the internal politics of that nation, which ultimately has a tertiary effect on the geopolitics of that region, right? And so this is why, even at the local national level, at the independent operator level, things like cybersecurity and physical security are so important, because there are secondary, tertiary effects that kind of grow out globally if you don't have these kinds of things, these physical and cyber critical energy infrastructure asset protection initiatives in place. And that's the thing about energy security. Let me talk about that for 1 second. It's really energy security, and the concept is a two-pillar concept. There is this geopolitical, almost resiliency component to it, which is, hey, and I think it should be called energy resiliency. Sarah and I have this argument often. It is about, hey, energy security at the geopolitical level is about resiliency. Where am I going to get my next 100 million barrels of oil? At my level, it's very tactical. It's very, hey, how are we going to protect that piece of critical energy infrastructure, right, in order for it to be optimized and monetized? And so when you think energy security, it sounds sexy to the folks who talk about it geopolitically. But when you say security, what you really think in your head is, how do I protect that asset? And that focus is necessary in order for there to be a geopolitical conversation about resiliency, because ultimately it's always about continuity of ops, right? And those who invest and those who operate need to think continuity of operations. If they do that, then particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, you're going to see more of a robust play to ensure that these assets are secure.
Great. So actually, I'm going to jump in with a question. We're getting actually now lots of questions from the audience, so I want to try to bring some more of these in. Andrew is asking about, to what extent are African governments mandating minimum standards for assets in terms of protecting assets? But I want to open that question up just a little bit because before the webinar started, we were talking also about how it's difficult to even know what the risk is because there's not a lot of incentive for reporting. So Derek, if you can maybe start from that perspective, and then Sean, if we can move to the regulatory end of things on your side.
Yep, sure. So one of the things that you find happening is the reporting on incidents that happen, right? Usually the incidents that are reported are incidents that are just so major that they couldn't hide that information if they could. And the problem with this is that operators, local operators in particular, if they have certain types of attack, physical attacks, even cyber attacks, if they report that, what's impacted? Their insurance, A, and B, their ability to raise more cash, right? And so that is a problem really continent-wide because it impacts people's understanding of the environment that they're operating in. And so again, we recommend that, you heard me talk earlier in the conversation, Katie, about making sure that there's a periodic assessment done, right? And I think that the insurers and the investors need to be more, I want to use the word deliberate, but what I mean is somewhat maybe forceful about mandating that the owners and operators have these periodic assessments done so that we get some understanding about, hey, what is their real posture against these potential threats that exist? Because if you don't do that, right, then you have some, whether it's a black swan event happening or not globally, you get a situation where your continuity of operations are impacted, all because you didn't take the simple steps to continue to have continuous assessments done to make sure that you maintained a certain amount of posture to deal with those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the regulation side, I mean, I can see Andrew's chat, and yes, banks have that minimum standards and your minimum amount of funds that you must have available, for withdrawals and in case something goes wrong. As far as I know, I can't think of. I'm trying to think of I can't think of any government mandated regulation that say like an oil company has invested. Has $100 million worth of equipment offshore, and they must have $10 million in a bank somewhere just in case something goes wrong. I don't think governments, as far as I know, anywhere have that sort of regulations on oil and gas companies. I mean, like Derek was saying, I think what companies use obviously is insurance, which isn't always the best way, and it's not actually, I don't think people don't get insurance thinking, well, if something goes wrong, this will protect our workers, this will protect the the environment. This will protect the local citizens. They think, well, this will protect our bottom line. If we need to claim something, we will get it back from insurance. But I mean, and from personal experience here in South Africa, I know quite a few business owners that took out the pandemic insurance for their business many years ago for a couple $100 a month, and then tried to claim it and said, well, we have a pandemic and my business is going under. And it's amazing how insurance companies have turned that around and said, well, actually, you haven't lost business because of pandemic, you've lost it because of the lockdown, which wasn't, that's not covered. And I think, like Derek said, one of the issues with insurance is there's no kind of incentive to try and say, well, here's everything that's happening here, and this is why we have insurance, because your insurance will just go up. So in the end, as far as I know, and I mean the research, I might have done this quite a while ago, there aren't any regulations that protect, I guess, that protect the people or protect the assets or protect the country. It's would be companies looking after their bottom line.
Sure. So I want to move on to another question we're getting from the audience. And this is something that Euriso actually asked kind of in the beginning when we first got started. But looking at, we've talked a lot about, we've talked about Mozambique, about Nigeria, some of these more established oil and gas markets on the continent with FID, with planned projects, Nigeria's case with production. But what is the outlook for more pioneer markets? Euriso brought up the example of Sao Tome. And as we're looking at these pioneer markets, I also wanted to get into this concept of high risk, high reward, and what that scenario in terms of investment looks like in this environment. Maybe Sarah, can we start with you?
Well, I think this is a very important point that was raised, because just looking into the investor's mentality, what they are looking is like every investor we work in, we have been during this process with many different investors for their risk reward analysis. So any investment company, before they actually look into any asset to invest, they look into both an analysis of their risks and rewards. And looking into a place that has a high risk, even a high security risk, does not necessarily mean that investors are not interested in investing in those assets. Obviously, the regulations, the terms of investment, and the reward that an investor looks into it, they're all points that investors would look at it. And we think that there are plenty of markets in Africa that investors would be interested, and the history shows that too. There are areas like Nigeria that we discussed about it. There is plenty of high risks of insecurity, both insecurity of infrastructures, the threats against the infrastructures, regulations, and political risks that investors are facing that. But many investors with higher risk potentials and risk capabilities continue their investments in these markets. So again, it goes back to all those analysis of risk reward analysis for each type of investors for any specific asset. It all depends on the opportunities, resources. If you look at it, obviously, again, when we talk about Africa, I like to zoom more country specific and resources specific, because it really matters. And Derek mentioned that geopolitics or overall market studies for energy security sounds sexy, but it is important, as it is sexy, because it's really important before into that strategic view and into, again, going back to that risk reward analysis, is that what type of resources we are looking at it, and for how long and how much demand is there out in the global market for that type of resource? How much is the cost of the production? So these are all what makes an asset very very attractive for investors. And obviously, it very much depends on a risk potential and resiliency of investors. Derek mentioned that security is not a cost, but an investment. But when we look into companies and investors, obviously there are different range of investors with different range of risk tolerance. And so again, I think this is, I would just summarize my answer that it very much depends on those risk reward analysis of a company, on the assets that we're talking, resources, the global demand for long term, that how much really the world is in need into a demand for that resource, the production cost, and then we have other issues like security, political security, security of assets, and regulations in any specific country or case that we're looking into that.
I was wondering, I mean, how much can we really expect governments to step in and help mitigate that risk, and how could they do that now in the current climate, Sarah?
This is a very good question, because there are issues that now may be a good time for them to be resolved. The taxation systems in many of these countries, the transparency over the resources and resource ownership, in some of countries, again by case regulations in many of these countries need to be revised. And another thing that Derek mentioned to that is like the relation between government and companies is like how clear, how many middlemen are involved in between companies and the government. Obviously, there are some corruptions issue, like how regulation could minimize these corruptions. Could the more clarity a government could provide to investors, that's, I would say, the best incentive. Obviously, the regulations, how much they are making, the rewards are important, but transparency and clarity is something that all investors require to make sure that they could invest in a protected environment. So at this point, I would say the easiest way for governments to start with is to regulations, to revise the regulations, to create and increase that transparency for the investors, so the investors would have certain clarity of views when they're entering these markets.
James, I want to add a little point to that too, and it's more, again, tactical in nature. One of the things that you'll find for most nations, they look at now, and this is specific to mining and oil and gas, natural resource assets. Theoretically, they will tell you that from a tactical perspective, that the government, the military maybe even, or the local government law enforcement is in charge of protecting that asset. But here's a problem: they don't have the capacity and capability to do it, right? And so when you talk about high risk, high reward, low risk, low reward, Sarah is completely correct that to really make that transparency available about how government interacts with commercial companies who are dealing with local companies who want to, again, optimize and monetize that asset, that is clear about why that's important, and why even from an energy security geopolitical perspective, that's key to the success of the project. There's the other side of that, which is, well, again, how do you protect that asset? And you'll get chapter and verse from some of these countries about their capabilities with respect to protecting the personnel and the asset to really want to attract that foreign direct investment. When you get on the ground, sometimes there are real challenges about their capability to do that, right? And so not only for governments and local national operators, but for independent international companies that go in and operate, whether they are, the operators or the service companies, they need to really make sure that they're getting assessments done so they understand where they stand in this whole spectrum that we're talking about. Without that, they take on risk that they should not take on, because, again, some of these countries just don't have the capacity to protect the asset from a physical or cyber perspective.
I would say that also leads to some rather, some very interesting scenarios down the road as well, with private security forces and all sorts of things like that. And yeah, I mean, what's your take on that, Derek?
Well, we saw what happened in Mozambique when Wagner Group tried to come in. It was a complete disaster. And then you'll get other private security forces that come in that only know one side of the game, right? Which is boots and fences. They don't really understand this other piece I keep talking about, which is this domain awareness superiority, understanding the human terrain, understanding, what are really the key performance indicators that are most important to the asset operator. They're not taking any of that into account. And so one of the things that I will tell owners and operators on continent, be careful about who you pick to be your security provider, right? Sometimes you need companies that are focused on protecting energy assets because they understand the KPI around that. If you get just some random security company that it doesn't matter if they, they'll come in and provide the same type of security scenario or methodology or solution for a hospital that they would a flow station or oil and gas platform. That's just not right. And so you've got to be very conscientious about who you pick to provide this kind of protection for you, again, because it impacts your ability to maintain your continuity of ops and gives you a chance to really kind of optimize and monetize the asset. Am I making sense there, James?
Yeah, if I could also just add to what Derek said, I mean, I completely agree. I think one of the issues is that, I mean, if Mozambique, as an example, there's a South African PMC in their DIC group. But I think that they're not taking into account the complexity of the situation. They're looking at like, well, if we kill them all and then we win. And much like Afghanistan and Iraq, all they're really doing is losing the hearts and minds of the people. I mean, you could see that when they were in Mochamboa de Praia, people cheered the rebels coming in and don't really know what to call them, because I mean, I think it's almost been simplified. I think it's human nature to want to simplify things, but in Mozambique is saying, oh, now they're ISIL. So now this is a war on terror. And it's a much more complex situation than that. And I think what Derek's point is exactly spot on, that if you are looking to go to one of these places, it's not cut and dry of, oh, well, the military, the government military has hired a private military and they're going to wipe them out. It's much more nuanced than that, and there has to be other programs and other scenarios at play to make sure that you may be deterring the violence, but you're also stopping future recruitment and future violence and trying to get down to the base of it. So I think for anyone, I mean, going into something like Mozambique or a new pioneer territory, it's really making sure that you have an absolute understanding of the jurisdiction and the situation, and also having a plan in motion to not just think, well, I'm going to go in there, the government will take care of this, and my good job is just to take it out of the ground and get it out. But there's actually a lot more to it with corporate social responsibility and, social investing. I think is socially responsible investing should be the new kind of catchword for people looking to invest in Africa, and making sure that if you go into a place, you leave it in a better place than it was when you got there.
I think we can all think of lots and lots of examples, where this applies, and South Sudan is another place where all of these things are very, very relevant. And I just wanted to ask one more question on this to Sarah, maybe kind of carry it over to Libya, which is another hotspot that I know that you're a bit more focused on. I mean, how is this relevant there? What are the prospects to getting production back online there?
So again, this question I would say that it goes back to our discussion that some of the challenges have already existed in Africa before COVID hit the global environment. So Libya, the same case of Libya, all this political instability in Libya have hit the production significantly, and also export of oil. But what is the implication and effect of COVID is to amplify the economic impact of all this political instability. Libya obviously is now exporting way lower than it was exporting back in January, but now at way lower oil prices because the prices of oil have been reduced significantly. So this means a more economic challenge. And then if I want to expand this from Libya to all over oil economies in Africa, this is the same case. This is going to increase insecurity because all these countries that are already challenging with certain levels of social insecurities or insurgencies, insurgent groups, or their domestic political instability. In the case of Libya, the government would not be able to be committed from the payrolls to all those social investments and pays that they were doing, even paying for their own securities. So the insecurity is going to expand in some of these countries, or there is a dangerous danger of expanding in these countries if they are not capable of paying and securing and have enough reserves to secure their own stability in these countries. And again, going back to your question about Libya, this is a perfect example. Libya's production have dropped significantly, not because of the COVID, but as an impact of all these political instability in the country. But now they are selling all those smaller volumes of oil in much less prices, which means higher negative impact on their economy. So it's a place to watch, especially for security, because of all these complications. As much as there is opportunities in every crisis, but also should be very keen and concerned about the security implications of lower cash in the pocket of governments.
Great. And to get back to a question from the audience quickly, we have a question from Frederick. And Derek, I'm going to direct this one to you, I think. But he's asking what new emerging technologies are on the horizon for energy security, and if there's anything in the artificial space. And I'll just add on to that question to maybe if we can focus even specifically on some technologies that are really relevant for Africa. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I'll answer that, and then I'll also talk about what I'll do is I'll talk about or I'll try and create a segue into cyber as well from that, right? So from a technology perspective, I think when you do things like implement AI and machine learning chatbots, right, that go out and start to cull information in the market, cull communication, so you get a better picture about your environment, your threat environment, having sensors out there that really give you kind of that full-time domain awareness. Back to the chatbot AI piece, which really plays into your understanding of the human terrain, using that to really cull the media, to get some kind of sentiment analysis about your project and what's going on, to see who really has, from a communication standpoint, a negative posture toward the implementation and the activity / operation of your event. Those are things that really are very key to put into place. I'd also say too, from a cyber perspective, making sure again you've got an assessment about your cyber posture. One of the things that we all know, a major event that happened, only got a little bit of publicity, but it's kind of close to home for folks with Africa Oil and Power. When we did Angola Oil and Power, or Angola Oil and Gas, during that week, Senegal had a ransomware attack that happened at their headquarters during that week. And so a large part of what you see in sub-Saharan Africa on the cyber side is the exposure that happens between these information technology, operational technology systems. As Sarah talked earlier, she mentioned this whole thing about, hey, for operational things that you have going on, all of that is monitored by some IT system. And unfortunately, in sub-Saharan Africa, you have a lot of exposure on the IT systems because they're legacy systems, they're old Windows systems, and the number of attack vectors that exist on those systems to get after the SCADA data, the potential manipulation that could happen, the potential stealing of corporate data that can happen is scary when you look at it in its kind of a single silo. And so from a recommendation standpoint, if you permit me, I would like to say that, again, you take a look at these assessments, you speak to the owners and the operators and the investors and insurers and say, on the cyber side of the house, guys, you really need to pay attention to upgrading your systems, making sure that you've implemented the right kind of security protocols that are kind of NIST 800 series 171 driven, so that, you don't think that, hey, I've got a Norton antivirus on this machine, I'm good to go. Ask the senior leadership at Senegal about what an impact that was to have a massive ransomware attack during really a week that was supposed to be used to showcase, the Angolan oil and gas industry. So, use technology, use things like AI chatbots, like machine learning, to really help you get an understanding of the environment you're operating in, and that'll ultimately impact your ability to maintain your continuity of operations and ensure that you've got a good resiliency posture.
Great. And actually, Sarah, I don't know if you want to comment on that. I know that you were doing a webinar, and I think the webinar itself got hijacked, essentially, yeah?
Yeah, it was a couple of weeks ago. There was a similar webinar on future of oil and gas market, and it was hacked and, as you said, hijacked. So we are looking into this closely, and I think this is a very important area, especially when it comes to the security of grid and electricity, because looking into especially some of the countries that are having higher temperature, they are warmer, many countries in Africa, the security of grid at some areas, especially rural area, is important for security of food, for security of water access to the people. Well, we cannot still compare the whole access of electricity in Africa with the rest of the world, but when it comes to infrastructure, even all this security, cybersecurity is very important for security of infrastructure and data, water, electricity, food. So it's really important.
Certainly. So I'm going to move to a question from Irene, and I'm going to edit it slightly because I think we've addressed some of this. She says, what is the role of geopolitics in the petroleum sector during COVID-19 and post-COVID-19? I think we've addressed the during COVID-19 pretty effectively, but I think it would be interesting if we just chat a little bit about what this looks like post-COVID. And maybe there's still a lot of questions there, but Sean, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I guess the question is, and it's obviously a very difficult thing to look into that kind of crystal ball and say this is what it will be like post COVID, because things have, I think if COVID's than anything, it's made us realize that we know nothing, and we don't know what's going on, and it's very difficult to predict. But I would say that when we're through with COVID, and I think Africa will actually, on a whole, for the majority of African countries, from the fear I think that a lot of people had when we saw what was happening in China, in Europe, and I know in South Africa, and we said if it gets down here, it's going to devastate us. It's going to be really, really bad. I mean, especially in poor areas in the townships where TB and HIV is prevalent, it's going to be really bad. And it has not been good, but I think on the whole, everyone was surprised about how few, especially at the beginning, few deaths we had and few cases we had. And I think that's kind of gone throughout the continent. When we are through with this, I think a lot of the same risks will remain. There are fears and risks that there's a lot of elections being postponed. Chad, Ethiopia, a couple other smaller by-elections being postponed. There are risks that, especially in countries that are already quite authoritarian and not very democratic structures, that COVID-19 has and is being used as an excuse to restrict democratic institutions and spaces and increase authoritarian power. So one of the major risks is that might continue after, and they won't, it gets ratcheted up, but it doesn't come back down after. So that's quite a risk. But I think I saw someone said at the beginning on the chat, there's also opportunities that are coming out because of COVID that I think that, I mean, especially for the stuff I do, I think companies always hate to talk to me because they think I'm going to tell them don't do this investment because of this. But there's actually a lot of opportunities coming out. While with the depressed economy, there's also undervalued assets that are available for sale. I think PE's, private equity, is going to be hopefully growing after this, trying to look at those assets. I think there's also going to be a change in supply chain. I think there's a very big opportunity through teleconferences like Zoom for a lot of jobs to leave Europe, leave America, and actually come down here. Instead of flying people every couple of weeks to be it Angola or Mozambique or South Africa, why not employ local people who can do the job just as well, if not better? And then they can teleconference into the headquarters, be it whatever they might be. So I think as far as what geopolitics in Africa will be like, I mean, it's very difficult to say. I think the same risks that we have now will remain. It's not going to get better, but I don't think it's going to get necessarily very, very worse. I think there might be some areas that might be exacerbated, but at the moment, either biding the time, but we haven't seen very much. So I think it will remain the same, but I think at the same time, there's a lot of opportunities that will open up because of this that investors can take advantage of.
Thanks, Sean. I wondered, Sarah, if you want to add anything to that.
Well, I mean, I think if you look at it globally post-COVID, what would be the main changes into geopolitics of energy in general? What we look is into the new energy trade ties, because obviously now we have the demand shock and the price shock having significant impact on the certain producers and producer countries. So it's going to have impact on their supplies. We are seeing impacts on demand. Also, we are talking a lot about demand shock and demand recovery, but the demand recovery is not very symmetric. We see that, for instance, now that some of the lockdowns have been eased, the demand for gasoline, for instance, have grown very fast because people are driving. They're feeling safer in their cars rather than using public transportations or flights. But on the other side, the demand for jet fuel or airplane fuel have not recovered very much because people are not taking flights as much as they used to. So all of these are going to have impact on the prospect of, let's say, for instance, refinery margins, the demand for lighter crude oils in long term, the demand for different types of crude oil. So these are all going to have impact on the whole geopolitics of energy. If you look at it into Africa, it's going to change the investor's view. Obviously, those assets that have lower production costs would be more interesting for the investors to look into that. Again, gas, Africa is going to be a major player in the gas market, both on the demand side and on the supply side. Significant portion of demand growth in the next couple of decades is coming from Africa. On the other side, Africa is going to be a major producer and potentially exporter of gas. So these are all going to be changes that we're going to see in the next decade to come, but those that are specifically related to COVID, if I want to talk about geopolitics of energy, they are those that are related to demand and supply for certain types of crude, certain different regions, and potentially new trade ties that could have that could change the geopolitical map of the world globally after this pandemic is somehow leave us, hopefully soon.
James, can I add to that too? Because I think there's again this nexus between the geopolitics and the physical protection side, right? You look at South Sudan, you look at Nigeria, you look at Mozambique, you look at Angola, you look at Libya, right? These really great markets where there is a lot of oil and gas opportunity, even power utility opportunity, right? Because of the sizes of the populations. One of the things that the governments, right, not just the parastatals and not just the energy ministries, it's the governments themselves, the executive offices have to do is they really got to tighten their messaging around this physical and cyber security of the assets that they have, right? So you heard me talk about earlier that they may talk a little bit about it for the operators who come in and say, hey, we'll protect you. And there's some challenges there because they don't really have the robust capability to do that. But I think there's also a gap in terms of the messaging that these governments give to foreign direct investment. They don't really they don't put enough energy behind making this effort of saying, hey, our environments are secure for you to invest in because we can protect your people and we can protect the asset as it's operating, right? You've been there, you've seen the conversations, even the ones that I've had with people about, oh yeah, the government can handle asset X. The government's got great offshore capability to do Y. Well, when you go there tactically on the ground, that's not the case. And then there is this flip side of that coin, which is they'll talk to an operator about that, but they won't take that message more seriously and then talk to the foreign direct investment crowd about that to attract more investment into the country to help operate and monetize that asset. So that's a recommendation I'd like to make to the governments that are listening here, which is say, hey, let's take a step back and get our messaging right around our ability to attract people and let them know they'll be secure from a physical and cyber standpoint if they come operate in the country. That's impacting geopolitics, writ large.
Yeah, so I want to take the geopolitics and bring it to a much more micro look. Njayuk, the chairman of the African Energy Chamber, has asked, what lessons have we learned from the Niger Delta in dealing with host communities that other African countries can learn from, especially when it comes to avoiding criminal attacks on infrastructure? So this idea of, really involving the community to try to avoid those situations.
I'd like to, as you know, Katie, I've looked at this problem pretty significantly. We have a subsidiary office that operates out of Abuja. Our headquarters is in Abuja, and we've got an operational office in Lagos, and we've just done some operations in the creeks for some people. And I think the key to our success was understanding the local community and how to engage them. You look at Shoreline, for instance, and you look at what Kola and Tunde Karim have been able to do in spite of the challenges that they have about their operations for OML 30. They really have gone the extra mile to really figure out how to engage the community and bring them into supporting the operational activities of that asset, right? You've heard me say on this call a few times about domain awareness superiority. If you don't have an engagement plan that helps you manage the human terrain, you are constantly going to have physical exposure to physical attacks, and now cyber attacks that are going to ultimately challenge your ability to be resilient and maintain continuity of ops. One of the ways I think you can do that too, that maintain this kind of human terrain engagement, this, maintain and achieve this domain awareness superiority, is you bring in these tech tools. Some of the folks asked questions earlier about what are the tech tools you can bring in. Hey, listen, there are things you can do to help manage the people engagement inside and outside the facility. There are sensors, there are RFID chips, there are facial recognition cameras, there are because of the fact you have employees who are from the local community who work there. It's about engagement programs with them, monitoring some of their communications. All those things are necessary in order to achieve this domain awareness superiority. But I will tell you that when you look at Nigeria specifically, some of this kind of local engagement that you do with the local moderators in the community, those things are important, they're impactful, but they need to be enhanced, right? And some of those local folks that you have who are acting as interlocutors between the communities, you need to arm them better so that they can give you better indications and warnings on how to manage your asset. And you can, instead of be so reactive to the threats and reactive to some of the things that happen to you, you become a little bit more proactive. And there's some good activity in Nigeria. There's some real, decades long kind of techniques, tactics, and procedures that people are using, but that can get better.
Yeah, and I think I would just add, I would echo Derek's statements, but I think the Niger Delta has taught oil and gas companies that you can't run an operation in the Niger Delta from Holland. You need to have on the ground. You need to have a local presence with local people, and there needs to be seen that you're not just there to take the resources and get out. There needs to be benefit to the community, and it's tough, obviously, because if you go to invest in an oil and gas company, you're not going to see a return on there for quite a while. But the locals want to see a return right away. If they're around, they want to see a return right away. And I think, a lot of the times, to mitigate political risk, a lot of the answers are having more social responsibility. That's a good way to stop having the local population turn against you, stop having the local government and federal government turn against you, and actually having boots on the ground and beneficiation programs, and showing that you're you're helping the community. You're not just there for the bottom line, even though companies are, but
Yeah.
there needs to be basically a marketing campaign and a proper social responsibility campaign to make the area better off than when you got there.
Thank you very much. I think we're actually going to bring the webinar to a close fairly soon. I do have another question and also an opportunity if you guys want to bring up anything that you feel we haven't really covered enough. But the question also kind of takes the form of a shameless plug. We're opening conferences in Mozambique, in Gabon, in Nigeria, in 2021. We're a business that's expanding in Africa, moving into new markets. On a more serious note, for a business like ours, or for anyone else in the audience who is doing the same thing, what would you advise them very quickly? What are the risk factors, and as a business, what do they need to do right as they come in? Sarah.
I'd like to take this from where Sean finished, the importance for investors, the importance of understanding the different stakeholders. Often the investors are very much committed to their shareholders, but very important to realize that the stakeholders and the society as a stakeholder is very important in Africa when it comes to Africa. As Sean brought a very good point that some of these assets are taking a long time to have a return, but the society and other stakeholders beyond the shareholders are looking into the returns. They want to see a better life. They want to see improvement in their lifestyle. So going back to that question about the investment, some of these major companies that have been invested in these areas like Nigeria, we see that they're companies with higher risk tolerance, but also companies with higher risk potential and tolerance. The companies that are investing significantly in the society for somehow maintaining the stakeholders and the society beyond their shareholders happy and create that relation with the society. So I think that was a very important takeaway that I wanted to bold it. The other thing is that I just noticed that there was a question here for me. Someone directed a question for me in the chat that if I would think the geothermal energy market would be affected due to COVID-19, and about those potentials in Africa. As of now, we do not see any particular threat to the geothermal market in Africa. Kenya is already working a lot into expanding the share of the geothermal in its energy mix, also the Eastern African countries. But again, going back to the whole experience of energy market looking in the whole history of energy market, we are always dealing with uncertainty. So the only thing that we can be certain is that we're dealing with uncertainty, and we never can say never. But as of now, at this point that we are talking together, we do not see a significant threat posing against the geothermal market in Africa.
Great, Derek.
I got a couple of things I want to say. From a recommendation standpoint, I just cannot overemphasize the importance of having these assessments done. And one of the things I've just found in Africa, in particular, is that they look and view, as I said earlier, security as a cost and not an investment, right? And I fundamentally believe if they change that posture from the NOC level to the IOC, to the IOCs coming in and mandating and recommending that the partners they deal with have this kind of posture, like the oil and gas service companies, right, to the local national operators and the parastatals, they really need to make security and the protection of critical energy infrastructure a C-suite level issue that is taken on almost a key performance indicator kind of ethos to it. That if you want to have an operation that is optimized and monetized, the security is an investment. The physical and cyber security of that asset is a top line item that needs to be not the responsibility of the security officer, it is the responsibility of the CEO of that company, right? And I don't know how many more attacks, I don't know how many more major events have to happen before that becomes a serious issue, but I tell you who's taken note of this. It is the global insurers and the investors. And if the local operators, the parastatals, the /NOCs don't take this into consideration, they're going to find it harder and harder and harder to attract this global investment to their operations. In addition to that, I want to answer a question on, can I do that, Katie? Do we have time for that? Because I've seen a few questions here at me. One of them is from NJ Ayak, right? Who talks about onshore assets stand to be very easy to come under attacks from criminal gangs. How can investors deal with this to avoid the huge losses in revenue and infrastructure? I chose that question for a reason, because it comes back to the very thing that I have said thematically through this discussion. You got to get an assessment, because if you assess where you are, you know how to create the right posture to mitigate that type of threat, that type of risk. And so again, I'll close on a final note. Get an assessment done, understand where you are, understand where you need to be, because that is going to ultimately impact your ability to maintain your continuity of operations and ultimately show your investors and insurers that you're resilient.
Great, thanks. Sean?
So what should companies do before they go into a jurisdiction?
Yeah, so just back to James' initial question, and then if you have any final thoughts.
No, it's easy. It will be short. I think the first thing you do is call Sarah, get an energy forecast, then call Derek, get a security assessment, and then you can call Yanni Intelligence, political risk forecast, and then you can go in.
Perfect.
Agreed. Well done, Sean.
Summarize that. Thank you everybody so much for joining us today. I'm just going to remind you that we have webinars coming up next week as well with Africa Oil and Power and the African Energy Chamber. We're looking at the pathway to grid stability in Angola's power sector, as well as closing deals, advancing FID during COVID-19. Otherwise, we just thank you guys so much. And I want to actually end with, oh, sorry, it's in this chat. Let me see. Sam said, be safe and enjoy life. And it's my favorite thing I've read today. So everybody be safe and enjoy life. And we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.